The chat window is on and we are getting messages from everyone, sir.
I'm typing a message in return.
Yes. And 5 questions have come up and our participants are already 342. Yes, Professor Srivastav is there.
Yeah, but remember, I'm on backup now because the generator is on.
Good Lord. Anyway, sir.
That's why I was off just now.
Yes.
Which means there will be again, one round where it goes off and on.
We're getting messages from everyone, sir.
I'm typing a message in return.
Can Deepak, can I hear you?
5 questions have come
Well,
up.
I can hear you, Ravi. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
All right.
Can you tilt the screen more towards yourself? Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
Because the generator is on.
Anyway, sir.
That's why I was off just now.
Yes.
Which means there will be again, one round where it. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so we are ready to go then. Can we start? We've had messages from Shay Redick as well right now. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alak?
So
Yes, yes.
if everybody is ready, it is 6:03 and can we just take off now, Professor Nair?
2 minutes. Let us wait 2 minutes.
2 more minutes?
Time.
Okay.
Deepak, I was saying I'm on a backup power just now.
Okay, so if it goes off, we will hold forth. And it'll take you about 3 minutes to come back, I assume.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, Alak, would you like to start?
So I will just start the thing and I'll call Alak sir to introduce.
All right. Okay.
Just a minute, Priyanka. Just a minute.
Let me know when you're ready, sir, because yeah.
Just देखो जी क्या हुआ.
We are already 401 people who have joined us. Many thanks to everyone. And I would also like to inform everyone we are live streaming on YouTube. If you do not get the opportunity here, please feel free to join IHD India is our YouTube link. Please move on to the YouTube where you will be able to hear this webinar, the lecture by Professor Srivastav. Professor Sharma, if we are ready, can we start?
We start.
Shall we, sir? Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture in the IHD-ISLE webinar series. We are very thankful to all of you for joining in. This will be a constant feature for us. And I would like to invite, welcome Professor Deepak Nair, who has agreed to moderate this session, Professor Ravi Srivastav, who will be delivering the lecture in this first series, and Professor Alak Sharma, who is the director of the Institute for Human Development and also the editor of the Indian Journal of Labor Economics for the Society, who is the man behind who has organized this whole thing. So welcome one and all, good evening to everyone. And I now invite Professor Alak Sharma to please introduce the IHD-ISLE webinar series, the lecture and the panelists.
Friends, I extend my warm welcome to all of you for participating in this webinar on migrant labor in the shadow of the pandemic. This webinar is being organized by the Institute for Human Development, IHD and Indian Society of Labor Economics under the webinar series COVID-19 and its implications for economy, work and livelihoods. And today's webinar is first in this series. COVID-19 is, I need not repeat, one event which has impacted many more countries in the world compared to any other event in the modern world. Probably after Great Depression of 1930s, no event has impacted economy and livelihoods so profoundly worldwide. Although fortunately in India, labor loss of lives has not been as high as many other countries in the world. Thanks to the lockdown, its impact on livelihoods and economy has been extremely bad, very severe. Also because of the isolation with the uh, outside world. Uh, uh, that is why IHD and ISLE thought to initiate this webinar series so that informed debate takes place on the impact of the pandemic and lockdown on work, economy, and livelihood. Migrant labor is one section of our society which has been most severely hit. Thanks to media, a lot of attention has gone to this deprived section. Although very deprived and constitute a large section of the society, not much is known, unfortunately, on this section about their various dimensions of the nature of their work, estimates, their numbers, as well as their contribution to the economy. Uh, they have hardly been given much attention to the policy making as well. I'm very happy that the first webinar series under this series is on migrant labor. There would be hardly any better person than Professor Ravi Srivastava, uh, who has to deliver this webinar talk, who has done extensive work on this topic. Professor Srivastava is currently my colleague in the Institute for Human Development and as director of the Center for Employment Studies. He is a very well-known development economist and has been earlier a professor in the Jawaharlal Nehru University and also a member of the National Commission on Enterprises in the informal sector. His work on informal economy, employment, social protection has been very well known. I am thankful to Professor Deepak Nayyar for agreeing to moderate this webinar. Professor Nayyar hardly needs an introduction in this kind of audience. He is currently president of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, and he is also currently Professor Emeritus Jawaharlal Nehru University, where he was professor earlier for a long time. He has held several important positions in his long career, such as Vice Chancellor of Delhi University. Also, he has been long time back Chief Economic Advisor of the Government of India. He's a leading development economist uh, uh, who has done very high level significant contributions to microeconomics, development economics, international trade, as well as international migration. Professor Nayyar is a regular columnist also and has been writing on lockdown and its implications for economy and all that in the media. Uh, I'm very delighted that all of you have joined, and there is a overwhelming response to this webinar. Close to 500 persons have already joined, and as Priyanka said in the beginning, we are live on the YouTube also. So with these words, I hand over to Professor Nayyar to conduct this webinar. Thank you
Yes,
very much.
yes. Thank you, Professor Sharma. Before Professor Nayyar comes in, there's just one piece of information. We will be taking on questions at around 5:40. We would not be able to take all the raised hands and everyone. We acknowledge your presence here, but kindly start. Sorry, 6:40, and kindly start. Use the Q&A window of your screens to place the questions to Professor Srivastava and Professor Nayyar. And with these words, I now request Professor Nayyar, President of the ISLE, and Professor Emeritus Denu, and the former Vice Chancellor of Delhi University to moderate the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Alak, and thank you, Priyanka. Let me welcome all of you to this pioneering event that has been organized by the ISLE and IHD. I am both touched and impressed by the presence. Uh, this is an evening that we have set aside to hear Professor Srivastav, essentially because I do not know of anyone else who has done as much work on migrants in India. There are only two propositions I want to set out before you very briefly to set the stage. First, the lockdown that was imposed in the last week of March uh, without any preparation, almost as a bolt from the blue, led to an acute humanitarian crisis. The plight of migrant workers in our cities, not just in constructions, but in restaurants, in delivery services, in courier services, in personal services, was grim. They were deprived of their livelihoods, of their dignity. Uh, Most of them had no shelter. Most of them did not know where their next meal would come from. And therefore, many set out, despite the lockdown, on foot with their families to walk home hundreds, thousands of kilometers. In the end, they were simply stranded in the megacities or locked down in relief camps. It's only now, 6 weeks later, that the government has made a decision that they can return home. So you can imagine how trying a period, how tortuous a period it would have been for them without their families, without shelter, without enough food. Uh, the second proposition is that this has led not us who live and work in this world, but citizens and society at large to recognize that migrant workers, not simply in the construction sector, uh, but almost everywhere, are the sinew, the muscle of the urban service economy. And that economy would collapse without their presence. Um, with these words, I would like to invite Professor Ravi Srivastava to deliver his lecture. And perhaps at the end of it, I might come back with a couple more propositions. Ravi, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Deepak. So I just want to warn everyone that at the moment I'm on a backup generator. If the electricity comes back, there may be a 3 or 4 minute pause before I can regain my internet connection. So welcome everyone to what is now popularly known as Lockdown 3.0 to remind us that we are now in the era of the of IT era, more dependent on IT than ever before. And thank you so much for Deepak for agreeing to moderate this discussion. I couldn't have thought of two better people in the area of migration. Your own work on globalization and migration in a historical sweep is so pertinent, so relevant to also understanding what is happening today in many ways. And Alak's work, Dr. Alak Narayan Sharma's work on migration in Bihar, which has been followed up over many years by the IHD teams who have taken, who've done surveys, resurveys, followed up the migrants to urban locations and so on. So thank you both for being here with me, along with many, many people. I'm sure that the people who are listening to this lecture, some of them are experts in the area, but I expect that many of them would be, willing learners and who want to listen to this story on migration, simply because migration now, everybody knows what labor migrants are going through in this country under lockdown. My own interest in migration actually began nearly 40 years ago when I started surveying rural villages in the context of looking at rural transformation and looking very closely at the links between migration and rural transformation. And this journey continued. I remember when we were in the National Commission for Enterprises in the unorganized sector, and when we presented our report on social security to the then Prime Minister, Professor Manmohan Singh, he raised the question of portability and migrants. And I remember then in 2006, we organized a seminar with IHD, in collaboration with IHD, in which we tried to invite grassroots level organizations which were working with migrant labor. And we could barely find a handful. From then to this stage, when we have a large number of individuals and organizations engaged with the issue of migration, working on the issue of migration, I think we have really come of age in actually understanding what labor migration, what labor migrants go through. And I think we'll come to the next stage. That is how exactly to visualize the problems of migrant labor in relevant ways. Since the lockdown, a number of organizations working on, we have a galaxy of young scholar activists and activist scholars who have brought out a series of reports on the conditions of migrant workers. The first report by Jan Sahas, two reports actually by Swan in each phase of the lockout, the second one appearing today. An excellent report released yesterday by Ajivika Bureau on migrants and the urban sphere. So we have heard a whole series of reports. I know at least of 6 reports, and these are by younger scholars who in collaboration with activists. This is the new sphere, the active sphere which has come up, and I really need to congratulate these scholars and activists for focusing on this issue. My recent work has been in collaboration with some of my former students, and I need to acknowledge this collaboration with Arvind Pandey, with Tanya Devnath, with Balakrishna Padi, and 2 young colleagues at G.V. Pant Institute, Allahabad, Kunal Keshri and Kirti Gaur. Most of my recent empirical work has been in collaboration with them. Let me point out that my lecture will be some 40 to 45 minutes, and I will go through a presentation. Maybe at some point I'll switch off the presentation, but at least you will not have to see my face for the entire duration of this conversation. But you know, the audience then, and then of course we will come back to the more substantive issues. I want to also tell you that I will not be focusing on one area, very relevant area of migration, which is Indian workers abroad, international immigrants. That issue is becoming more and more important with every passing day, particularly in the issue of Indian immigrant workers to the Gulf cooperation countries. There was a time, I remember in 2002, I wrote a paper with Dr. Shashi Kumar, where we talked about the linkages between international immigration and internal immigration. And now things have come to a pass where 51% of international
I think we've lost Ravi's voice.
The power situation, kindly bear with us. He'll be back with us.
Oh, I see. The power is back.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe I could use that time instead of the sound of silence to put before you a third proposition that has surfaced with this humanitarian crisis of migrant workers in urban India. Most of us are aware that agriculture provides directly or indirectly employment to 45% of our people, but it contributes less than 15% of GDP. So that GDP per capita in the agricultural sector is about 1/10 that in the non-agricultural sector. Ravi, are you back? No. And this highlights 2 real problems of the Indian economy. First, that the employment elasticity of output in agriculture is not just 0. In large parts of India, it's negative. So that the proportionate growth in employment could be nil or negative for any given rate of growth of agricultural output. And that creates a push factor for rural migrants to move to cities. The second is that levels of income per capita in the cities are about 10 times what they are in villages. Now, that is just in terms of what people think of as private income entitlements that enables you to support private consumption. Okay, I think Ravi is back. But
you.
yeah, just 10 seconds. And this creates an enormous incentive for people to move into the cities where their income is higher, not in terms of wages alone, but in terms of consumption associated with the social infrastructure that is so much better in the cities. Ravi, back to you. I was just holding forth.
Yeah, so I was saying, well, I'm glad that this electricity came back early on in the session and not in the middle of the session. I was saying that I will not be touching upon the issue of international immigrants. The issue of Indian workers abroad is becoming very, very pertinent with every passing day. We are under pressure, both from the workers and with the countries where they work, particularly in the Gulf cooperation countries in particular, to bring them back. We have naval ships and Air Force planes standing by to bring them back. But at the geography of immigration from India, immigrant workers has changed enormously. In the last 3 years, 51%, nearly 52% of these workers came from 3 states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and West Bengal. 43% of these workers came from 2 states alone, UP and Bihar. So the 2 states which provide for the bulk of internal immigrants also provide for the bulk of international immigrant workers now. And this will really test the capacity of the states as international repatriation starts happening along with the Indian immigrants, the migrants returning to the respective states. However, this is not an issue which I will be touching in great detail. I will now be switching to the presentation and carrying on from there. So just give me a minute. Okay, so slideshow. Okay, is that okay? Is everybody able to see the slide?
No.
No?
It's just you are visible.
So you'll have to share your screen.
Okay. I've shared the screen, but when I share the screen, so why doesn't it happen?
Yep.
Okay.
You're there, Ravi.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think, you know, Deepak began by talking about Indian migrants, but let me remind all of us that the pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of migrants all over the world, not just India. And in India, the labor migrants were impacted by most of all. You know, the category most impacted by the containment strategy, the lockdown, and Deepak has described to you how it happened suddenly, without any planning, without giving the migrants any time, or the stranded populations to return home. The reason why the impact has been felt most by the migrants for several reasons. First of all, anything which is done post-lockdown is most difficult to reach. We have always described labor migrants as difficult to reach groups. So it is very difficult to reach relief or any measures to the migrants once lockdown has happened. The lockdown has now, the pandemic has now exposed the fault lines in the Indian labor market and Indian society. And we have seen how much discrimination migrants are facing and their lack of citizenship rights. We now see how little governments and employers know about this massive section of the workforce and how policy has ignored them or has actually worked to their detriment. And this is something I'll come to in my presentation. This talk will try to bring conceptual clarity regarding the migrant groups impacted, present estimates of their numbers, try to locate labor circulation within India's pattern of capitalist development, and will flag short and medium-term issues. Now, what is migration? I'm sure that in this audience, we have a large number of scholars who probably don't technically know how we define migration. So let me say that migration is defined as mobility of populations, which has two aspects. First, a change in administrative jurisdiction, and secondly, over a particular temporal period. And this is defined in two ways. You can be born elsewhere, or you may have lived elsewhere. So you may be living in place A, and now you are living in place B. So therefore, two criteria, two dimensions. One, of having moved across administrative jurisdictions. Secondly, having moved for a certain period of time. In India, the administrative jurisdiction is a village, and the period of time is taken as 6 months. There are exceptions to this, but usually these are the two indicators that we have to categorize a person as a migrant. Now, this is purely an administrative categorization. Different countries may use different norms. For example, administrative categories are different. Many countries use districts and not villages. Some countries use the equivalent of our blocks as administrative jurisdiction, and only movement across district or block is defined in migration. In our country, in rural areas, if you move from village A to village B, also you're described as a migrant. Now, this administrative definition of migrant, which we also use in the census and the National Sample Survey, is very different from the socio-political connotation which is usually applied to migration. In the socio-political sense, migration is very often based on notions of identity and exclusion, inclusion, and different notions of temporality and jurisdiction. So you may actually have lived in a place for 5 generations and still, because of ethnic considerations or language considerations, be considered as a migrant in that place. So issues of identity become very germane to the socio-political discussion on migration. Of course, migration excludes commuting. And that's because commuting happens over a short period of time, and people come back to the place of residence from the place of work. Having described to you what migration means, I want to get to to basically looking at different forms of migration. And I begin at the bottom of this slide with what we call short-term circular or seasonal migration, also including a category of migrants whom I call long-term migrants, but without fixed abode. But the major category is of circular seasonal migration. The term circular migration was used and popularized by my friend and senior colleague, Professor Jan Bremen. It described migrants who go out for periods of time, maybe go from one area, one destination to another area, work in one sector and then another sector, and then eventually return to the place of origin. These are migrants who do not have a foothold in the destinations to which they move. They may spend some time in those destinations, some periods of months. Very often these periods of months are generally less than a year, but there can be occasions when they stay on in a location for a year, more than a year, sometimes 2 to 3 years. Construction, for example, construction laborers in the heydays of the construction boom were moved from site to site by their contractors and stayed on sometimes for more than 1 year, sometimes 2 to 3 years before returning to their origin, their village. These are people I describe as short-term, circular or seasonal migrants. These are people who are not included in the census enumeration. And I'll come to why they're not included when I talk about the census. The short-term, circular, and seasonal migrants work either as casual workers in the informal economy, or they work as self-employed workers in the informal economy, or sometimes as regular workers, as salaried workers. But the point of departure for their categorization is the fact that they do not have a foothold in the areas of destination and they come back to the areas of origin. The second category, which is a much more complicated category that I wish to introduce, is the category of the long-term circular migrant or the semi-permanent migrant. Now, this is a much more complicated category because the long-term circular migrant is a migrant who has obtained a tenuous foothold in the area of destination and then tries to strengthen that foothold over a period of time by negotiating with the urban spaces or wherever he or she is located, but always looking backwards, sending remittances home, maintaining a foothold in the rural areas, returning to the rural areas if work is lost or under adverse circumstances, or at the end of a life cycle of work. So maybe remaining in the destination area for some years and then coming back to till his or her land or do other things in the rural areas. So the long-term circular migrant is a much more complicated category. And this migrant is partly captured by the census and the NSS, partly underdocumented or undocumented. Finally, we have the straightforward category of the migrant who's enumerated by the census. Mostly, these are long-term or permanent migrants. This is the stuff that development economics is made of. People who move from rural areas to urban areas, one urban area to another urban area. They also work in the formal sector as formal workers or are in the top layer of the informal economy, but not all. Many of these workers also work in the informal economy as regular workers, as informal sector self-employed workers or informal casual workers. What I have done in my work, in my academic work, and many of you might have seen some of my papers, that I describe this category of informal workers as vulnerable migrants. So all the circular seasonal migrants that I have described are vulnerable migrants. Almost all, not all, but almost all the long-term circular migrants are also vulnerable migrants. A section of the long-term labor migrants also happen to be vulnerable migrants. The pandemic has impacted on the entire informal economy, on all the vulnerable migrants who are a large subset of the informal labor, of the informally employed people in the Indian economy. The census enumerates only the first group. The reason for that is that the census draws a line. The census will enumerate you if you have lived in an area for 6 months or more. It should enumerate those migrants who have moved to destinations for more than 6 months. But as it happens, many of these migrants continue to live in work sites. They live in hovels. They live in shared accommodation, in tenanted accommodation, or in open spaces. Therefore, the census or the NSS are not able to enumerate them. The census or the NSS are able to enumerate some part of what I call long-term circular migrants. One of the issues that I will keep coming back to in this presentation is that a large proportion of these migrants, the circular migrants, are not enumerated in urban areas. They're not enumerated at their destination areas. They're enumerated in the areas of origin in the rural areas. And of course, the bottom line of this lecture is that the circular migrants who do not have a foothold in the urban areas or a stable foothold in the urban areas or who lost this foothold in the pandemic are the ones who immediately look back at the rural areas and ask themselves, should we go back? We have lost our jobs, we have lost our incomes. And remember, the 65, 2/3 of the short-term seasonal migrants actually live on work sites. They live on construction sites, they live in workshops and so on. So they don't have in any case an abode in the areas of destination. The rest of them live in hovels or in open spaces. So these are the people who the pandemic struck the hardest. I just want to introduce you to the degree of ignorance which exists in official literature and in the official in the officialdom about who these migrants were affected by the pandemic. The government of India, in response to one of the the issues which was raised in the Supreme Court, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Home Secretary, filed an affidavit. In the affidavit, the Secretary of Home in India identified the migrants, the number of labor migrants in India, supposedly who could have been impacted by the pandemic. In this slide, on the left, I'm showing the total number of internal migrants in India. And in fact, this number had increased remarkably between 2001 to 2011 from about 309 million to 449 million. On the right, I'm showing to you the total migrant workers in rural and urban areas and the number of workers seeking, who initially said, the migrants who said that they migrated in order to seek employment. And you will see that 40.09 million workers in all cited employment as a reason for migrating over a period of time. This is as far as internal migrants are concerned. As it happens, 41.4 million migrants surveyed in the census said that they migrated because of trying to find employment. The Secretary Home cites this figure from the census as the people, as the migrants impacted by the pandemic. And the reason why I give this figure is to again reiterate that circular migrants who are most impacted by the pandemic are actually not enumerated in the census. But the Secretary Home had no figure, no estimation of this migrants. I understand that he asked the Ministry of Labor and Employment. The Ministry of Labor and Employment had also no estimate of circular migrants in this country. So just to tell you that over a period of time, I have been trying to make broad estimates of the number of short-term circular migrants in this country. The NSS put out one estimate, but the NSS estimates only consisted of people who had migrated out between 2 and 6 months. And the estimate that the NSS put out was 15.2 million people. In about 2011, in a paper, I made a detailed estimate using sector by sector figures. And I argued that there were about 45 to 50 million short duration circular migrants, of whom 10 million were agricultural laborers. I also estimated that there were about 35 to 40 million self-employed or informal regular workers who were also vulnerable migrant workers in urban areas alone, and that both these categories total 80 to 90 million vulnerable migrants. Now, since then, I have updated these figures, and I've also done this in the context of this lecture. I did this in 2018 in a paper which I wrote for the Indus Exclusion Report. I looked at the construction sector in detail, and my estimates were that about a quarter of workers in the construction sector were interstate circulatory migrants. An equivalent number were intrastate circulatory migrants, people who moved within the same state. And therefore, I estimated that there are about 27.5 million circular migrants in the construction industry alone. Using estimates of the proportion of circular migrants in other industries, I estimate that the total number of circular migrants, short-term circular migrants in the country is between 55 and 60 million people. These migrants, let me reiterate, are not enumerated in the urban areas, but are enumerated in the rural areas. I then went on to estimate the other vulnerable migrants, including the semi-permanent, the long-term circular migrants and other migrants who are in the urban areas. And I estimated that these workers would currently be about 60 to 80 million out of a total informal workforce in the urban economy of about 150 million. So what we are saying is that roughly 35 to 40% of the entire informal workforce of in urban areas consists of these vulnerable migrants. To these, we must add the migrants who are circulating between rural and urban areas. And then the total estimate of such workers is between 115 million to 140 million. So we are talking about people who work in the urban areas as migrants, whose numbers are between 12 crores to about 14 crores. I'm not counting their families or accompanying members as they migrate, because those numbers would be correspondingly larger. Now, I'll just quickly run through the characteristics of some of these short-term circular migrants. These are well-known figures to a lot of you, but just to give you a profile of these migrants, there are two sources of data: the NSS 2007-8, which collected migrants on date of who migrate between 2 and 6 months, and more recently, the India Human Development Survey in 2011-12. So this is a very short profile of that. Firstly, to tell you that the short duration migrants are actually concentrated in the poorer consumption quintile. They are much poorer than the long duration migrants. That is something we know and we would expect. Secondly, there is a preponderance of deprived social groups, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes among the short-term circular migrants. They come from the lower social orders, so to say. Third, seasonal migrants without resources, without endowments, actually travel much longer distances than long-term migrants. Half or more than half of these migrants travel to other states for work. Fourth, interestingly, if you look at the states which predominate in the number of circular migrants, these states are a mix of low income, middle income, and high income states. So they include Bihar, UP, MP, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Karnataka, Jharkhand, Tamil Nadu. The reason for this is, of course, that large states have large inequalities within them. And there's a large amount of intra-state labor circulation. But however, if you look at interstate circular migrants, then it is the poorer states which predominate. Bihar contributing more than a quarter, UP, MP, West Bengal, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Odisha. These are the states which predominate as far as interstate seasonal outmigration is concerned. And this is the point that I was talking about. This gives you the orange bars, gives you the number of migrants from each state which go to other states. The blue bars are the migrants who circulate within the state. And you see Bihar, the orange bars at the bottom, UP, MP, all these are predominantly interstate migrants. But if you look at Maharashtra, these migrants are predominantly intrastate. If you look at AP, these migrants are predominantly intrastate. Gujarat, almost all the circular migrants are intrastate. Karnataka, most of the intrastate, most of the circular migrants are intrastate. So large states also have the large middle income and high income states. Many of them also have a high number of circular migrants, but these circular migrants circulate within the states. Which industries do they predominate in? Construction stands out. The NSS says 40% of the workers, the seasonal circular migrants, work in the construction industry, followed by agriculture, followed by manufacturing, and then we have a whole host of industries, including the service industries. Destination, and if you look at these destinations across industries, you see that agriculture, as you would expect, most migrants, there are about a quarter of agricultural circular migrants go to other states, 3/4 circulate within the same states. Mining, it's almost half and half. Manufacturing onwards, states predominant, and services, most of them within the same states. Construction, a little more than half go to other states, the remaining work within the same states. So you get a picture which is very varied in terms of intrastate circulation within industries and across industries. Agricultural labor migrants, as you would expect, predominantly circulate within the same states. A quarter go to other states. And this is the need which is currently being expressed by states like Andhra Pradesh and Punjab. The need that they have for interstate migrants. This is also an extremely important statistic. The India Human Development Survey tells us that half the labor migrants, half the seasonal migrants actually are recruited through contractors. And if we look at the industry profile, which we have not presented, in several industries, including construction, nearly 2/3 of the migrant workers are recruited through contractors. And this has tremendous implications, not only for their conditions of work, but this also has implications for the way the pandemic has impacted on these wage workers who are recruited through contractors, most of whom became unavailable as soon as the sites closed. I want to say a little more about the relationship between circular migration and the development process. You know, when I say these points, I sometimes feel that I'm echoing my colleague, Professor Jan Bremen, because he has written so extensively about the circular migration. Let me just state some of these things and maybe we can come back to them. First of all, migration and circular migration are circumscribed by uneven development. In India, this has implied the decimation of rural and forest-based livelihoods, growing regional differences, and concentration of economic activities around growth centers. All of this has increased several times in the last 30 years since liberalization, as inequalities have increased between rural and urban areas and between regions. Circular migrants are neither rural nor urban. You can call them either multi-local or translocal. As they work away from rural areas, their foothold in their areas of origin becomes weak. They never acquire a foothold in the urban areas. There is a close link between the nature of migration with the hierarchical nature of society and with the initial endowments that these migrants have. So the migrants with the least physical endowments and educational resources, and those who come from scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and so on, predominate among the short-term, seasonal, and circular migrants, predominate among those categories of work which are the most disadvantaged, such as bonded labor and bonded child labor. The nature of circular migration is structured by how the labor market is evolving over time and key concerns of labor cost and control over the labor process. So while unequal development circumscribes in a broad sense the direction of migration, actually labor migration, the nature of labor migration and circulation is structured by how the labor market is evolving. And these are 4 or 5 major issues which I would like to flag. First is the link of labor circulation with informality and labor flexibility. As informality and labor flexibility have increased over time, so has labor circulation. All 3 have increased over time. Labor circulation, circulating labor, provide the most flexible labor to capital. Secondly, labor circulation and circulatory labor exists within segmented, a specific nature of labor market segmentation and labor market fragmentation, which promotes discrimination. So labor market segmentation and discrimination go hand in hand. Of course, this is true not only for migrants, this is also true for women, this is also true for other discriminated groups. The issue of discrimination, the issue of recruitment is very specific to labor circulation, to labor supervision, to payment mechanisms. So the labor contractors play a very important role in the recruitment, in the supervision, in the way payment mechanisms are evolved in order to immobilize circulatory labor. And therefore the link, a strong link, which I have and my colleagues have described in the literature between recruitment and neo-bondage. Neo-bondage is immobilizing labor through debt mechanisms. And this is very, very rampant in many of the industries where circulatory labor works, whether it is quarries, whether it is construction labor, whether it is brick kilns, whether it is spinning mills, and so on and so forth. And finally, circulatory labor migrants are positioned at the bottom of the labor heap. We call it the 3 Ds. They predominate in difficult, dirty, and dangerous work. They're discriminated and they predominate in difficult, dirty, and dangerous work. Pick up any industry and you will see this. They are nowhere citizens, and nothing could have demonstrated this more than what happened in the aftermath of the lockdown in India. They are non-citizens in destinations. They have very weak citizenship in the source areas. Part of the reason is also because they come from the excluded groups in the rural areas. And this leads to their socio-political and economic exclusion and discrimination. And we have seen how labor migrants have been discriminated by state, by organs of state, by a section of civil society in the aftermath of the pandemic. All the policies that we can speak of have a sedentary bias. They are made, all the social protection policies, labor regulation are made for sedentary workers, for the sedentary household. They are not equipped to deal with translocal populations, with migratory populations. So regulatory frameworks are weak. They are much, much weaker for circulatory migrants. Social protection mechanisms are weak, but they are much, much weaker for circulatory migrants. The location, the labor circulation, I would like to underscore, is located in a specific strategy of capitalist development in India. You might call it the race to the bottom, or you might call it the low route to capitalist development, where capitalists, instead of focusing on labor productivity as the engine of growth, focus on lowering labor cost and offering labor the minimum subsistence that can possibly be offered to them. So with this broad thing, I think I hope it helps you to understand why we are dealing with a section of the population which was, in a sense, which was tailor-made for feeling the impact of the pandemic. No foothold anywhere, nowhere citizens, discriminated at work, discriminated in their places of location, and at the bottom of the labor heap. Let me now go to the policy, some of the policy issues. Deepak, I'll take another 5-10 minutes at the most. I know I've taken a lot of time, maybe 7-8 minutes. Is that okay?
If you could, because we would get then about 25 minutes for Q&A. So if you could.
So I'll try to, I know that each of those issues will develop much greater elaboration, but maybe that can come later. So let me first focus on the short-term policy announcements that have maybe made and the policy imperatives which should be there. Because the short-term is so important. The degree of desperation, hunger, lack of income that we have seen, and which the reports, the Swan report released yesterday, the earlier Swan report, all the reports that have come out have highlighted, including reports in the media. So the pillar of what the government has had to offer has been the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana. And I would argue that this was not only very inadequate, but also very poorly targeted. In general towards the poor, it was based on a complete lack of understanding of the impact of the pandemic and of course of the migrant labor communities. So it was not meant for them at all. Then the government came up with increasing the scope of food aid and shelter. Shelter meant quarantine for these workers. In my estimates, it was able to reach about 1/3 of the migrant workers. If you look at the estimates of the workers that government and non-governmental organizations were able to reach, and the estimates of the migrant workers that I have presented in this paper, it came up with a scheme of ex gratia payments for construction workers welfare boards. Construction welfare workers board, let me tell you, it is a known fact that they're unable to register or offer benefit to interstate migrant workers. So this did not touch them. I will not go into other aspects of the construction workers welfare boards. A lot is known because of the Supreme Court case and the final order of the Supreme Court in 2018. And finally, the repatriation policy, which came up because of incessant demands of the migrants, mired in confusion. Repeated orders, repeated positions taken in the Supreme Court, increasing the cost for the migrants several fold. There was hardly any risk had the migrants been allowed to, hardly any health risk, had the migrants been allowed to go home if they wanted to at the beginning of the lockdown. And now we have a situation of increasing risks and costs, and all of them being shared, the financial costs being passed on to the state governments and the non-financial costs to the migrants themselves. So the urgent policy imperatives, we at the Indian Society of Labor Economics had sent a letter to the Prime Minister and the state governments. And I think most of what we spelled out on the letter still stands. We had talked about universal income transfer with some exclusions, extended food support, transport to be provided by the state government to migrant workers, and an extended and expanded Manrega program and rural regeneration. All of these issues are extremely important in the immediate context. And these are now, I think, possibly, there is a broad consensus among them, but we know that the government has not been able to follow up with any of these measures. Let me turn to the short to medium term policy actions which are required. And I'm going to propose 8 issues for discussion. Perhaps some of these issues will be able to take up in detail in the discussion. The first is issues of ending duality and segmentation in the labor market. So what I'm arguing is that our focus now has to be on creating a stable workforce which can lead to high productivity. Employment in the organized sector must be made on a model contract between the worker and the final employer. Final employer should be fully responsible for advances, transport expenses, and wages payable to workers. The role of contract employment and contractors should be comprehensively reviewed. So we need to move on to a completely new template of employment where we do away with the distinctions that we have between formal and informal employment, first of all, in the formal sector of the economy. Second, the second imperative comes now in the provision of universal and improved access to public health for workers. We now understand what an important public externality health is. You cannot confine if you know The virus may have come from the rich and have permeated Dharavi, but once it reaches Dharavi, you can't permanently convert Dharavi into a containment zone. In the long run, you have to ensure that work sites and home sites and workers have better access to health. And therefore, we need to reflect on how this can be done, both at workplaces, at places, and of course, to the families of the workers where they live. Much greater investment will be needed, but also mechanisms. The third issue is really, which I want to highlight, and this I want to highlight, I'll be doing this also in the context of social security, is because this bill on Code of Occupational Health and Safety and Working Conditions is already there in Parliament. It's a very important bill. And I would argue that after the pandemic, in the light of the experience that we have gained from the pandemic, the bill in its present form should be scrapped. It should be comprehensively reviewed in order to see whether it meets the health and safety concerns of the workforce in India. Its existing provisions of promoting duality and segmentation in the labor market through fixed-term employment and contract labor should be thoroughly done away with and reviewed in the light of what I have said earlier. My fourth, the issue which I want to flag is the issue of housing for migrant workers. We realize that we cannot build a wall between the workplace and the places where workers live. So we need to provide conditions of housing for workers where they have access to basic amenities, and this, the model of ownership, the house ownership that we have at present, and is not sufficient. We need states, local governments, and employers to invest much more in housing for workers and to be much more attentive to their housing needs. Fifth, this is the importance of creating an architecture for a universal social protection floor. Although we have many schemes, we learned from the crisis of 2008 that the country should have ensured a social protection floor to all vulnerable persons. This did not happen. The draft code on social security, which was the second version of that draft, which was produced in 2018, was based on a universal approach. But the final bill, which is there in Parliament, has abandoned this approach in favor of a segmented social security and a non-universal approach. This bill, again, must be thoroughly reviewed in the light of the lessons of the pandemic. I want to argue again that the key ingredients of the NCUS proposals, universal registrations, a minimum level of universal social security entitlement, and complete portability continue to be valid propositions even today and need to be built up. The reasons why I am flagging these two bills is because there was conversation some days ago that the government of India may bring in these two bills in the form of ordinances. And I think this would be disastrous if we have to deal with the post-pandemic situation. Sixth, I would argue that till a universal architecture for social protection emerges, the central government needs to ensure that there is portability or complete portability of social security entitlements for migrants. I have written a great deal on this recently, including in a working paper on the IHD website. I can come back and flag more issues if required. Seventh, I think we need to go back, rethink on how we can have a strategy for regionally balanced strategy, regionally balanced development and rural revival. Because so that we can address issues of unequal development. It's not only a short-term issue because migrants have gone back to the rural areas, but in the long-term issues, we need to redress the imbalance between regions. And finally, and this is an issue which I have been flagging for some time now, the need for evolving a framework for non-discrimination in labor markets. We need to link discrimination in labor markets with a framework for non-discrimination at societal level. The pandemic, I wish to argue, has brought out the best in Indian society. Look at the initiative the civil societies have launched, but it has also brought out the worst in us. The prejudices, the discrimination, And some of the worst forms of discrimination we have seen has been against labor migrants. We need to evolve a framework. This has to do with the societal discrimination. Going beyond that, we need to evolve a framework and mechanism for monitoring discrimination and discriminatory job discrimination. And this, of course, cuts across migrants, but across other discriminated groups, women, minorities, and so on and so forth. So I would leave it here. These are just thoughts for reflection as far as the short-term to medium-term issues are concerned. I have not gone into a broader set of issues because each of these issues I know can be dealt with within the scope of an entire discussion, but I do need to flag these important issues. Thank you very much, Deepak. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much indeed, Ravi, for what was a very lucid presentation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of those who have been listening to you have learned a lot in this webinar. Now, I have a dilemma. It is close to 7:10. We are meant to finish at 7:30 p.m. That gives me about 20 minutes. In my chat Q&A box, I have 99 questions. And in my chat box, there are questions too, probably another 50. So there is no way I can possibly invite 150 people to ask their questions. So what I'm going to do is, under the circumstances, a second best strategy, which is that I am going to distill a few questions that have been put for Ravi Srivastava. There are clusters of questions, okay? Now, for those whose questions do not come up, please forgive me. I hope you will understand, and we'll plan time much better in our next webinar. And there are two questions that are addressed to me. I will list them all and basically then ask Ravi first and come back to the two questions addressed to me in conclusion. You know, first, there is a request from many people that Professor Srivastava's PowerPoint be shared. I just pass it on to him. Now, there is a set of questions which is essentially about before and after. What happens when migrants return to their villages? Do they find employment or livelihoods? If they do not, do they return to the cities? Or even if they do not, do they not return to the cities? So people are asking a whole range of questions. They're differentiated, but essentially about what you think, Ravi, would happen to migrants once they go home. Will they stay on? Will they return to cities? What are the implications of this? There is a second set of questions about gender, yes, where, you know, how can we analyze differences between male and female migrants in this process? And many people have raised that question. There is a question also, there are many questions about policy. Now, in fairness, many of them were keyed in before Ravi came to the concluding part of his lecture. And I hope he has addressed that to your satisfaction in terms of short-term, medium-term, long-term, what needs to be done. Another set of questions relates to what this will do to poverty in India. Surprisingly, no one asked what this will do to inequality, but the poverty question is there. And a number of people are suggesting, not asking, or even asking, should there be for migrants in urban India, particularly, Ravi, whom you described as vulnerable migrants, a employment guarantee scheme of the sort that Aruna Roy and Nikhil Dey have proposed, or a universal basic income scheme, which both IHD and ISLE have discussed earlier. Let me, you know, I could go on, but I think in fairness, I need to stop the questions for Ravi. There were two questions that were addressed to me, two sets of questions, may I say, that, you know, in this choice between lives and livelihoods, what should we do? I will answer that question, and I will not take more than a minute to do it at the end. And the second question, also widely asked, is what would be the consequences, moving away from Ravi's canvas, that if migrants from abroad return to poor states, or even if they have not so far, they do, there is going to be a major collapse of remittances. So what is this going to do for the well-being of those international migrants and their households? I will address that question too. So Ravi, let me pass on to you. We have 15 minutes. I will take 3. You can take 12.
Hello.
I have many comments to just saying thank you very much. Yeah, Ravi, to you. If you can take about 10, 12 minutes, and I'll come back in the end. It says your internet connection. Please start. Okay? Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. So Deepak, I'll answer the question of before and after first. The circular migrants that I have talked about are of two kinds. You know, the short-term circular migrants. Some of them have land in rural areas, have some land in rural areas. They go back and assist in rural operations in peak times. And it so happens that, you know, the peak times also coincide with lean activity in the destination areas. For example, when paddy is being sown, when Kharif sowing operations happen, and so on. So they are able to adjust their migration cycle with the agricultural cycles in areas of origin. The second are people who are working in a more irregular migrants, you know, like in construction now, where activity has become, it's no longer a seasonal activity in migrants. They work 12 hours a day, 10 to 12 hours a day, or even in informal manufacturing. And they work sometimes 7 months, 9 months, 10 months, 15 months before returning to the rural areas. Broadly speaking, these migrants do not any longer see themselves as part of the rural workforce. Part of the reason is that they're really burnt out in the spans in which they go back to the rural areas between in spans of unemployment. They're just too burnt out to be part of the rural workforce. And I have seen this time and again in my fieldwork. What I envisage is that in the long run, almost all of them will revert to the urban areas. You know, the overwhelming majority will revert to areas where they will be able to find employment. Remember that the urban areas and the destination area economic activities are going to open out very, very slowly. They will first open out with the help of what are called core workers. So industries will start putting back their core workers to help them with maintenance activity, getting their plants in working shape and so on and so forth, and gradually expand the workforce. And the migrant workers, I believe this is a sequence which will happen over several months, and that the migrant workers will eventually join back the urban and the destination workforce as and when expansion of activity happens. So in a sense, I don't see this as as you know, the industry has been voicing its concerns, but those concerns, in my sense, in my view, are futuristic, because no industry is going to open out and start working on 100% capacity in the immediate future. That's the first question. Now, the gender and child issues, gender issues, and I'm clubbing them with child issues. These are very serious issues. We've had several reports on migrant workers, very detailed reports, and I referred to them in the beginning. I'm still not aware of how this issue of single women migrants has panned out. My own sense is that they have relied on their kinship network in destination areas to forge their future strategy, whether it is in terms of, they have been as very impacted, of course, the severe impact, but they probably have stronger kinship networks. They have kinship networks, and they possibly will use them to revert back to rural areas. I am more worried about the child workers. I'm more worried about the child workers because the child workers, and Kailash Satyarthi brought this up in an NDTV interview some days ago, they are brought through recruiters. The recruiters would have disappeared. The child laborers are still stuck in many areas of work in and around the urban areas. How will they ever get back? And in fact, Kailash Satyarthi made the point, oh, can we, I mean, he said, look, I'm going to write to the government. Maybe we should give these people a chance. If they're willing to send these children back to the rural areas, the areas of work, we should not penalize them for engaging the child labor. Let them come out into the open. So that is another very important area, the area of child migrant laborers. On the impact of poverty, I mean, this is a cataclysmic event. The impact on poverty is going to be humongous, as it is going to be on employment, as it is going to be on GDP. Right now, we are dealing with hunger and desperation, and somehow it is not getting across to the policymakers the extent of desperation, the extent of hunger that is there. And of course, we are going to see this in panning itself out in years to come. On this whole question of EGS in urban areas, you know, we at NCUS actually did a lot of thinking about EGS in urban areas. We did come up with a scheme, which was a skill scheme, a skilling scheme, which was an equivalent of an EGS in rural areas. I think there would be need for an EGS in urban areas. There would be need for an EGS in urban areas. But remember, the EGS in urban areas, who will it be for? If it is like the rural EGS, if it is going to be for urban citizens, it is not going to be for the constituency that you and I are talking about today. It's not going to be for circular migrants. It is not going to be whether short-term or long-term. Okay, so if citizenship is going to be a criteria, civic citizenship is going to be a criteria for offering urban EGS, however difficult it is. The second thing is, please remember, the capacity of urban local bodies is even in smaller cities is even worse than the capacity of panchayats. So we will need to think this through. How do we actually get something like an urban EGS through? On the question of a universal basic income, actually, when we thought this through at ISLE, were very careful in suggesting income transfers as an emergency measure. The long-term architecture of a social protection, which we still feel, many of us feel, will have to be in the form of essential services and income support, will still need to be thought through. A universal basic income is perhaps the time for universal basic income going beyond the short-term emergency period is perhaps still not there. That is my opinion, but these are all areas on which perhaps we need to think more in the days to come. I'll confine myself to these 4 responses, Deepak.
Okay, thank you very much, Ravi. The feedback I see in my chat box is superb. Everybody has enjoyed the clarity with which you have made this presentation and how much you have managed to fit into this time. Let me now turn to 2 questions that were addressed to me, and a third question which Ravi took up towards the end on what this means for poverty and inequality. The first question is about the so-called choice between lives and livelihoods. Now, it is my considered view that this is a false dilemma. This cannot be an either or binary choice, because the relationship between lives and livelihoods is circular. If beyond a point there are no livelihoods, there cannot be lives. And to put the choice in the form of this dilemma, I think is misleading, because you cannot say to people that please choose between getting sick and going hungry. Most human beings would say, I would rather be healthy and I would rather be fed, both. And we need to recognize that the health of the people and the health of the economy are interdependent. Together, they shape the well-being of people. So that would be my response to the question about lives and livelihoods. The second question is about what are the implications of the collapse in remittances that is inevitable. Now, I think, India is the largest recipient of remittances in the world, close to 80 billion US dollars. And given that we run a balance of trade deficit that is $200 billion, together with software exports, remittances finance almost the entire balance of trade deficit, which would have had to otherwise be financed by capital inflows. If they are debt creating, it creates problems of debt servicing. And if they are portfolio investment footloose, it creates problems of volatility, not just in capital markets, but also in foreign exchange markets. So when something like 40% of this financing, the balance of trade deficit almost disappears, the macroeconomic consequences will be serious. And it will be, I would say, at least 2 years before we might get back to some semblance of where we were. It could be much longer. There is also the other side of the same coin, which is that remittances might be foreign exchange for the economy, which has a chronic trade deficit, but remittances are also incomes to support consumption and even investment in rural households. Now, Ravi told us that a significant proportion of international migrants, no longer as people would intuitively think come from Kerala or Gujarat, but a significant proportion, 40 to 50%, come from the poorest states, UP and Bihar. So it is going to have an impact at a micro level on the migrants and their households. For they will not, compared with migrants in megacities such as Mumbai or smaller capitals such as Trivandrum or Hyderabad, the difference in incomes is significant, but not massive. But the difference in incomes from what they earn in the Gulf and zero, which is what their income would be when they get back to their villages, is enormous. Third, let me say that, if we think back over the past quarter century, there has been a dramatic reduction in absolute poverty in India, as also in other South Asian countries. But in India, this dramatic reduction in absolute poverty is in significant part attributable to rapid rates of GDP growth, which were almost unprecedented outside China in human history. For 30 years, GDP grew at more than 6% per annum. Income per capita grew at more than 4% per annum. Now, when this growth not just slows down, which it has over the past 4 years, but this collapses, and I think in the current financial year, growth is almost certainly going to be negative. The disproportionate burden of that reduced income will fall on the poor, just as the economic and social consequences of this pandemic and government intervention to cope with it has placed a disproportionate burden on the poor. And please remember, Ravi was part of that Arjun Sen-Gupta commission, that there are two poverty lines. And between the two poverty lines, there are the vulnerable poor, who, when there is a crisis, it may be a bad harvest, it may be an illness in the family, it may be a pandemic, incomes collapse. And when they do, people who were above that basic poverty, that sort of higher poverty line, fall into poverty. People below the lower poverty line also fall into poverty. Now, remember that there is a triangular connect between growth, poverty, and inequality. In India, growth was rapid for 25 years. Absolute poverty was reduced, nowhere near as much as it should have or could have been if economic inequality had not risen. But economic inequality also rose rapidly. So I must say, I am concerned that there will be a dramatic increase in absolute poverty in the short run. And there will be an associate commensurate increase in economic inequality, both of which will have social and political consequences too. Now, with those words, let me stop here. I will pass on the screen to Professor Sharma and Priyanka if they have something to say. I would only like to say that on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank Ravi Srivastava for what has been an excellent session. Just as I would like to thank, excluding myself, the ISLE and IHD, I'm associated with both, for this wonderful initiative. So there are 2 minutes for you, Professor Sharma and Ms. Tyagi.
No, thank you very much for moderating very well this webinar, and of course Ravi for sharing his insights. We will soon announce, maybe in a day or two, by Monday, the next webinar in this series. The topic and the speaker. I hope all of you, the response to this webinar has been really very overwhelming. We had the limitation of accommodating only 500 people, and we got 500 people. Maybe many persons could not be accommodated because more than 1,000 had registered. So there has been overwhelming response. I hope, as Priyanka had announced in the very beginning, that it will be available on the YouTube. So I hope you join the next webinar series also. Thank you very much.
So I would like to just say thank you to everyone, to Professor Srivastava for such an engaging lecture, and thank you, Professor Nair, for taking time out and moderating it in such a beautiful way. Everyone has been acknowledged, and I would just like to add on our live streaming. I am seeing it currently here on my phone. YouTube, close to 75 people have engaged with us on YouTube as well. People have raised questions. There are people who have joined from far Northeast and Sri Lanka and other places. So this has been an overwhelming response. We are deeply touched. And yes, as Professor Sharma has just announced, this was the first lecture in the series of COVID-19 and its implications to economy, work, and livelihoods. We will have a series of lectures under the number of lectures under the series. So we look forward to your participation, to your support, and thank you all. Before I end, I would just like to say, people who missed out, all the registrants will get an email with the YouTube recording of this and the cloud recording of this particular webinar. So nothing has been missed out. And thank you very much. And please do like our Facebook pages, our Twitter. Please engage with us. Please, and for further involvements in our series and the lectures, please visit our website. We'll keep you updated with all the events coming up.
Priyanka, if I can just say one thing.
Yes, sir.
Before end, first of all, many senior friends and colleagues have joined us from abroad. Sir. I don't know from which corners of the world they're in presently. Aryan Dehan, my friend Christopher Leeton, Sher Verick, and so on. And many have raised, Prabhu Mahapatra, I can just quickly now see, have raised extremely pertinent questions.
Prabhu has asked a question of you.
So, which will allow us to focus on further work in this area. So is it possible for me to get a compendium of these questions to look at? Is it possible for you to save these questions in some form?
Sir, I'll try that and I'll get back to you on that.
If you can, then it will be very helpful. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much. At the end, I'd again like to say, please like our Facebook page. Our Twitter page is @tweetIHD, and visit our website for further updates on our webinar series. Keep helping us, keep engaging with us. We'll keep you engaged with all such kinds of policy, lectures. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining.